Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessel Norum, Baltimore. In Brazil, thousands of demonstrators took to the streets of Sao Paulo Tuesday following a Monday night where an estimated 280,000 protesters took to the streets nationwide, highlighting a range of concerns, including political corruption, inadequate social services, and to demand a just and sustainable development. The protests began last week in Sao Paulo over a hike in bus fares, organized by the Free Fare movement, which demands free public transportation. Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff condemned the violence, but said her government is listening to the voices calling for change.
The government and society knows that all violence is destructive. Sadly, it only generates violence. We cannot accept this. However, this does not detract from the peaceful spirit of those who were out on the streets to demand their democratic rights. These people must be heard. This was apparent. This transcends the mechanisms of the traditional political parties, class, and the press.
Now joining us from Rio de Janeiro is Julia Michaels. She's an American journalist and writer who's lived in Brazil for more than 30 years. She's the founder and editor of the blog Rio Real Blog. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So you were on the front lines of the protests in Rio de Janeiro. Talk about the scene there. Some American press has described it as riots. What did you see, and describe the mood for us?
Well, I wasn't exactly on the front lines. I'm older than most of the protesters, so I was actually a bit afraid, having seen what had gone on before in Sao Paulo. The police were very violent there previously. We were told to take vinegar for tear gas effects and to go with our faces well washed and not wear makeup because the pepper spray and the tear gas would penetrate more if you had an oily face. I mean, it was crazy, scary. But I was there, and I did see that the main avenue that cuts through downtown Rio was absolutely packed full of people. They say it was 100,000. I think it might have been more. That's also where a samba celebration happens during Carnival, and people have been comparing photos from Carnival when that avenue also gets filled up. And last night, it's hard to say when there were more people. But mostly what I saw was everything I saw was peaceful. People were dressed in white to try to underscore that. They were carrying flowers. They were singing. They were chanting. The people up in the office buildings were flickering the lights, and everybody down in the street was cheering them and saying, "Come on down and join us." And it was only really much later, in fact, after I'd left, that some people veered off from the main area of the where the marchers sort of ended up outside the municipal theater. They veered off and went over to the state legislature building. And it was a small group, supposedly about 300 people, attacked that building. Somebody threw a Molotov cocktail, and this is you can see it on television here on video. And then they went inside, they got furniture, they dragged it out, they made a bonfire in the street, they set a couple cars on fire. They also hurt some police who were not prepared for this kind of thing at all. And they wrecked some stores, a bank, ATM machine area was completely trashed. But that, the media here really has said that happened, but not made that the focus of the way they see what happened here in Rio last night.
And you've written yourself on your blog how even the media has gone from ignoring this to covering it. We've seen how the government has gone from initially cracking down on the protests that started a week ago to now Dilma Rousseff saying that the government is listening to these calls for change. Talk about how the protests has kind of, in a way, changed the game in Brazilian politics.
Yeah, I mean, people have been calling on each other to protest corruption, for example, for years. There's been, a day when you're supposed to go out wearing white or hang something out your window or go hug a tree. I mean, there's a million things, but it's been a very long time since this many people have really risen up. And I think the bus fare hikes, which happened simultaneously in Rio and Sao Paulo, and I guess in a bunch of other cities as well, just catalyzed so much discontent in the context of these mega events, which are starting to happen here in Rio and other cities too. The Confederations Cup just got underway in Brazil, which is a prelude to the World Soccer Cup. So I think, the bus fare hike, which really wasn't even that much in terms of the money, made people think again about a basic fact about Brazil, which is that it's a two-tiered country. It's a country that has hospitals that are private for the rich and crappy public hospitals for the poor. Same thing for schools. Same for public transportation. And so that the bus issue just brought all of that into people's consciousness in a very strong way. The way working people suffer on public transportation here is just unbelievable. There are people who get up at 3 and 4 in the morning and take several different buses to get to where they need to go. And they also pay a big chunk of their wages to be able to afford the transportation.
And what would you say were the root causes that maybe sparked this protest? Would you say that the events in Turkey, the occupation of Taksim Square, and other protests there might have inspired the rising up of protesters here in Brazil?
Well, I think there's two things going on. One is that the internet has a huge role, I think, both in Turkey and Middle Eastern countries and in Brazil. I think the 20-something generation is just a completely different generation. They think about things differently. They see the internet and all that it offers them as a chance to make a difference, and they feel powerful because of it. And so in that sense, yeah, I think Turkey is an example. And I also think, funnily enough, in Brazil here, there's something called a telenovela, which is like a 6-night-a-week soap opera that's on primetime TV. And the telenovela that just ended weeks ago took place partly in Turkey. And it focused on, was all kinds of, romantic stories, et cetera. But also it had, it focused on the issue of human trafficking, of women being taken from Brazil to Turkey to supposedly work in good jobs there, and then they got there in the story and found out that they were prostitutes. So Turkey is very much in people's minds, and I think maybe the novella had something to do with it. It's a funny coincidence, anyway.
And we've seen in places like New York, even where you have these mass demonstrations, and the police crack down using very violent measures that seems to get the public attention and gain public sympathy for these protests. Was that a factor has that been a factor in Brazil?
Definitely. The police in Sao Paulo were totally unprepared for what happened last week. And the protesters definitely got sympathy nationwide because of that. Here yesterday, the police were unprepared in another way. There weren't enough of them, and they weren't able to protect these buildings and things, the cars that were burned. Now they're saying that there will be thousands more police in Rio on Thursday for the next protest. And I also just read, just before we began to speak, that the army is saying that they'll be ready. And that's very scary in a way, because, the army are not meant to be acting against the domestic populace.
And finally, what would you evaluate as the prospects that these protests can lead to concrete change? We played a clip earlier where Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff said she's listening to the voices for change. She herself was a former guerrilla that was imprisoned and tortured by the Brazilian dictatorship decades ago. How receptive do you think her national government is going to be to these protests? Or are these protests just the beginning of a much larger movement that's going to need to take shape before change is implemented?
Oh, those are all such good questions. Well, I did see just a little while ago that some mayors in some of the cities where there were protests last night have reduced the bus fares. So that's already you can see the impact. And the mayor of Rio, I think right now, as we speak, is meeting with protesters about that. And the mayor of Sao Paulo was doing the same earlier. The thing is that, even though Dilma Rousseff comes from the left, comes from a dissident background in the 1970s and 60s, the government basically, although it's a leftist government, is sort of sewn on top of a political and social and economic structure that hasn't, in some very basic ways, has not changed. The two-tier society that I talked about before, it's still there. We have now included a lot more Brazilians in the formal economy. There are many more people who were lifted out of poverty. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty in the last decade, and that's very much to the credit of Dilma and her predecessor, Lula. But the basic structures of the way life works here still have not changed. And I think that's what these protests are about. And so that is a huge demand. I mean, how are we going to rethink public transportation in the whole country, basically? How are we going to rethink healthcare? How are we going to rethink a school system where anyone, the moment they have the tiniest bit of excess income, the first thing they do is put their kids in a private school? But I don't think the demands are going to go away. There's an awful lot of listening and dialoguing is going to have to happen, and it's going to take a while.
Julia Michaels, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
We'll certainly keep following these developments, and thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.